The child's ribs are visible through her shirt, and you already know what that means because you saw it on the cattle first. Always the cattle first. And then the dogs. And now her. The shirt is the same shirt she wore when she was healthy, and it fits differently now. You are counting. You're always counting now. Days since the last handful of rice. Days since the well dropped another foot. Days since you stopped being a farmer and became something else. Something without a name yet. Something that wakes before dawn and stands at the door looking at the sky as if looking harder will change what the sky does. The sky is clear. Perfectly, completely, mercilessly clear. 11 months before. The monsoon was supposed to arrive in June. Everyone knew this the way they knew the names of their own children. Not as information, but as the basic structure of the world. The monsoon came in June. You planted in July. You harvested in October. You ate? This was not a plan. It was the orders of things. Older than your father's father. Older than the name of this village. Carved into the rhythm of the Deccan Plateau the way the river carved itself into the black soil. Your farm is 11 acres of that soil. Volcanic rock ground down over 10,000 years into something so dark and fine, it holds moisture for weeks after a good rain. You grew up being told this soil was a gift. Cotton, sorghum, lentils. The soil would do its part if the rain did its part. The rain always did its part. June came. The sky was blue. Not the soft blue of a clear morning before the clouds build. The hard, pale, flattened blue of a sky with nothing in it at all. The blue of a sky that has made a decision you were not consulted about. You watched it the way you had watched your father watch it, the way his father had watched it before him. Waiting. Reading. Looking for the particular darkness on the southwestern horizon. That means the air is changing, the temperature is dropping, the Arabian Sea releasing what it has gathered for 11 months. The horizon stayed empty. The blue stayed hard. June ended. Your neighbor Rajan, the one whose laugh you could hear from your own field when something amused him, a laugh too large for his body, a laugh that started somewhere below his ribs. Rajan said in July that the monsoon was simply late. He said this while looking at the sky with the same expression he used when calculating the weight of a harvest. He said it with confidence. You noticed he said it without looking at you. You planted anyway. Because not planting was unthinkable. Because the soil was still holding the memory of last year's rain. Because the alternative to hope is something you hadn't learned to live with yet. The seedlings came up pale, thin. They grew 2 inches and stopped, as if they too were waiting for something. By August, the well was 4 feet lower than it had ever been in your memory. You measured it with a rope and a stone, and wrote the number in the dirt with your finger, because writing it in dirt felt less permanent than writing it anywhere else. The stone hit water sooner than you feared and later than you hoped. Rajan's wife, Mira, a woman who had brought your family food when your own wife was sick 3 years before, who had left it at the door without knocking because she understood that accepting help is easier if no one watches you do it. Mira began rationing her family's dal in August. You knew because you saw her measuring it in the doorway, her hands moving with a new precision that had nothing to do with cooking. The signal you noticed but didn't understand. Not yet. The birds changed their pattern. The crows stopped following the plow. You had turned the north field in July. The soil, dark and open, grubs everywhere. And the crows followed for 20 minutes before abandoning the furrow. Crows always followed the plow. You had seen crows follow your plow in a storm. These crows left. You thought it was strange for half a day and then thought of other things, because there were always other things. What you didn't know, what you had no way of knowing, is that somewhere above the equatorial Pacific Ocean, the surface temperature of the water had risen by 2 degrees Celsius that year. 2 degrees. A number so small it is almost nothing. A number that altered the pressure gradient between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, weakened the Walker circulation, shifted the monsoon winds far enough south that they deposited their rain into open water and not onto land. A change in the temperature of water 6,000 kilometers from your field decided, without consultation, that your field would not eat this year. Rajan's field would not eat. Mira's children would not eat. The thing killing you had no face, no name you could speak or walk toward with any weapon in your possession. In the district capital of Madras, the colonial offices recorded the rainfall totals for June through September. The numbers were the lowest since records began. They filed the reports. They continued loading 320,000 tons of grain onto ships at the port, because the trade agreements required it, because the price of wheat in London was favorable, because the viceroy had read a political economist named Adam Smith and concluded that feeding the poor would damage the market. The carts passed through villages where people were beginning to resemble the animal carcasses at the roadside. The carts did not stop. You didn't know about the carts. You knew only the sky and the well and the number you wrote in the dirt. By November, what you had understood in your body for months you finally understood in your mind. The harvest was gone. There was no harvest. 11 acres of black volcanic soil that had never failed your family had failed your family. You stood in the field and the stalks were dry, brittle, waist-high and hollow, making a sound in the small wind that you will hear for the rest of your life. A dry rattling like seeds in a gourd that someone already emptied. You knew the Deccan Plateau had entered drought conditions across 6 southern provinces at once because the cloth merchants in the village had stopped accepting cotton as payment. You knew the failure was not local because a man had walked through from the direction of Bellary and said there was nothing in Bellary either. This was not your farm's failure, it was the sky's. What that meant. And you were still working it out because working it out took longer than you wanted, is that there was no adjacent plenty. In any famine your father had ever described, then there was somewhere else, somewhere the monsoon had reached, somewhere with surplus, somewhere you could walk toward. That calculation no longer held. There was nowhere to walk. The drought touched the horizon in every direction. You did what needed doing. You slaughtered the ox. You sold the good plow. You took your wife's wedding bangles to the merchant in the village, and didn't look at her face when you put them on the counter. He gave you enough grain to last, if you were careful, perhaps 8 weeks. You hid most of it in the floor below the cook firestones, beneath a flat rock that had been there since before your father built the house. You kept only enough visible to make the house look as empty as your neighbors' houses looked. You rationed a handful of grain per day for the children, half that for yourself and your wife. The rain would come before the floor was empty. You said this with the same expression Rajan had used in July. You said it without looking at yourself. The ribs were visible through the shirt for a week before Mira came to your door. She knocked. You opened the door and saw her face and didn't need her to speak. Behind her in the lane, her youngest, the boy, 3 years old, the one who had learned to walk holding your fence post for balance. You had watched him do it, had felt something warm in your chest watching him. That child was standing in the lane with his belly swollen tight and hard. The wrong kind of swollen. The kind that means the body is no longer rationing reserves. It is consuming itself. Mira said, "We have nothing." She didn't say, "Please." She didn't cry. She said it the way you would state that the depth of a well. You looked at her. You looked at the boy. The lane behind them was empty. No one had seen her come to your door, which meant this conversation was still private, which meant the decision you were about to make was yours alone. Below the cook firestones there was one sack. In your best calculation, and you had made this calculation every night for 3 weeks, lying awake, running the numbers until they stopped changing, the sack would keep your 2 children alive for 20 more days, maybe 22. If rain came in that window, you could plant the fast-growing variety, the one your father kept for emergencies. It needed 18 days to produce something edible. It required water you didn't have. 20 days. 18 days. You had been doing this arithmetic so long the numbers had lost their shapes. Half the sack to Mira's family meant 10 days for your children, 10 days for hers. No one reached 20. The rain was not coming in 10 days. There was no version of events in which the rain came in 10 days. If you kept the sack, your children had 20 days. The boy in the lane had, by your reading of his stomach, perhaps 5. Mira was looking at you, not asking. She had stated a fact and was waiting to see what you did with it. And her face wasn't pleading, which was somehow worse than if it had been. A plea can be refused. A fact just sits there in the air between 2 people and doesn't move. Your eldest daughter was at the back of the house. She was 6. You could hear her moving. You looked at the boy one more time. You thought of the fence post. You thought of the sound your daughter made when she was hungry. A small, focused sound, not dramatic, just present. The way a stone is present. You went to the cook firestones. You moved the rock. You pulled out the sack. You didn't measure. You handed Mira the entire sack. She looked at it. She looked at you. Her mouth opened and she said nothing. And you looked at the lane instead of her face because her face was doing something you didn't have a word for. You said, "Go." She went. You replaced the rock over the empty space, put the cook firestones back where they belonged, stood in your own kitchen, and the floor held exactly what it had held before. Stone, soil, darkness. Except now you knew it was empty. Your daughter came in from the back room, asked if there was food. You told her to sleep. She looked at you with the specific expression children use when they are deciding whether to believe you. She went back to the other room. The wall was warm from the day's heat. You put your back against it and slid down until you were sitting on the floor, and the rock was under your leg, and you didn't move it. Outside, the lane held nothing. The sky above it was the same sky, clear, hard, pale, the color of nothing. The color that had been falling on you for 11 months without malice, without decision, without any of the things you'd need it to have in order to understand it as punishment. The sky wasn't punishing you. It was just somewhere else. Whatever killed you this year would have no face, would leave no name, would never stand in a lane and look at you. It would only not arrive. Somewhere. You didn't know where. You'd never know where. Carts were moving grain toward a port. Somewhere a number was being written in a ledger in an office in a city you had never seen. Somewhere a man who had never stood in your field had read a book by another man who had never stood in any field, and had decided that the correct thing to do was nothing. The rock was still under your leg. You didn't move. By the end of 1878, when rain finally returned to the Deccan, when the fields that still had someone to tend them accepted seed again, when the dead were still being counted, and would not be fully counted for 100 years, there was a word used in the government reports for what had happened. The word was scarcity, not famine, scarcity, a word from economics, a word with no body in it. You handed a woman a sack in a lane. You know what word belongs to that moment, and it isn't that one. The question the reports never answered, the question 150 years hasn't answered, is this: when the grain exists and the people exist, and the distance between them is a signature on a trade agreement, where does the disaster begin? And when you moved that rock, when you handed everything you had to a woman standing in a lane, was that the most human thing anyone did that year? Or was it only what anyone would do? And is there a difference?